Hello, my name is Kristen Sprotte, and I'm a student in the online section of Global Environmental Health. Today, I will be talking to you about Times Beach, a small Missouri town that no longer exists today due to the man-made chemical dioxin. The purpose of this presentation is to explain what happened in this town and why it is still significant today. We will talk about what happened, key players, government involvement, and legacy. As I explain the points listed on the purpose and objective slide, I will be using graphs to help illustrate these points. A snapshot of the graphs can be found on this table of contents slide. The overview of what happened is that a chemical called hexachlorophene was being manufactured, and it created a very dangerous byproduct, which is something that we'll get to in the next slide. A lot of the byproduct of hexachlorophene is waste, and a lot of the chemical waste was given to a recycling company called Bliss Waste Oil Company, which did not realize that the waste it was receiving was chemical in nature and hazardous. And so that same waste was then used as dust suppressant for a majority, for many areas in Missouri. And in addition to using it to spray, there was the dirt that had this chemical on it was later used as a fill for houses. That was another point where there was a lot of contamination. The chemical waste from the plant also leaked into a river, and there was evidence of this dangerous chemical in the fish from that river. And finally, in a farm site, there was also buried drums of this chemical waste. And so as you can see from this figure 1, there's about 26 places that are listed, and this soil volume on this side is what was affected with the chemical. And the reason that Times Beach in particular was called out is because it had the largest population. A lot of what you'll see over on the spatial graph is streets and expressways, so it's not people that are staying still. There are a few exceptions, but Times Beach was the largest. So some of the key players in this: Russell Bliss is the owner of the Bliss Oil Company, and he was the person that had carried the 18,500 gallons of this hazardous chemical and mixed it with some of the other waste that he had picked up from garages and airports, and was the one that was actively spraying this. Another key player is the pharmaceutical company that we were talking about in Verona, Missouri, which is the Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company, NEPACCO. The chemical that we were talking about is tetrachlorodibenzodioxin, TCDD is what we call it for short. Another key player, Shenandoah Stables, was on the list from the previous slide, and Shenandoah Stables is one of the locations where, after the dust suppressant was sprayed, a lot of the animals, including the horses at that stables, died or were seriously coming down with an unknown illness. And so for that reason, they contacted the CDC, who came back with evidence of this TCDD. There was some confusion over the half-life of dioxin, TCDD. it was thought that perhaps the half-life was less than a year, and that at the time that they received the reports, that most of it had been gone from the area. But if you look at the graph, you'll see on the surface of plants, it's so small, it's less than a day, that you can not quite see it come up. But I think the most important three are that this is in years, that dioxin could live for up to 7 years. Its half-life is up to 7 years in humans. It's up to 2 years in the soil surface, but then I think most importantly, it's over 10 years for beneath the soil surface. And so I think a lot of the chemical ended up beneath the soil surface. And so it was definitely still active. TCDD, dioxin, is one of the is the main chemical, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Dioxin's sort of like a family of chemicals, I guess, or byproducts, and it's typically formed during production of solvents, of paper pulp at times. In this particular case, it was used to create an antiseptic, and dioxins fall under the persistent organic pollutant family, and which means that they're very difficult to remove from the environment once it's released, and particularly it clings to dust. It was said in many of the articles that I read that TCDD was the most dangerous form of dioxin, and it was then interesting to find out that there's a lot of discussion still about whether or not dioxin in TCDD particularly has a threshold, and if there's some amount that is safe for you to be around before it becomes cancerous, for example. The other thing is that they're still debating is what exactly happens in humans, because obviously all the tests have been done on animals, and it's still to be determined. Particularly, there's one effect that is associated with acute exposure to TCDD, and that is chloroacne, which looks like a really bad case of acne. And there actually was never any recorded cases in Times Beach, which is interesting. One would expect that you might have a few of that. And I think I just looked at the exposure pathways. Another interesting thing is that one of the major exposure pathways for dioxin is actually through food. That's about 80% if you look at the radon graph below. Some of it is, there's a little bit of skin absorption, another third, like good amount of inhalation and ingestion of soil. But for the majority of the population at Times Beach, they wouldn't be ingesting soil. That would mainly just be a concern for younger children. And then I suppose inhalation would be the largest potential factor. The government became involved in the Times Beach situation 1982, which is 10 years after Russell Bliss had been spraying. There was a leak of some sites that could have been contaminated, and things moved pretty quickly from there. In early December, they had been taking samples of the soil at Times Beach and in other locations, and then unfortunately, very soon after those samples were taken, there was a massive flood that was a 14-foot wall of water from the Merrimack River, which is Times Beach is a flood zone, but this in particular was one of the worst floods. And after that, the government really said that they didn't think the residents should move back, because now all of the flood has kind of unearthed this dioxin that may have been dormant or under the ground for many years. So much so that in only a few months later, Ronald Reagan put together a task force, and the EPA Superfund decided that they were going to actually buy out Times Beach. They were going to buy all the houses and all of the businesses, and so they paid for a large portion of that, and Missouri paid for the remainder. In 2 years later, Times Beach, Missouri was disincorporated. There were no longer anyone who was living there. They actually, because of this, they decided to host the incinerator, which was meant to destroy all of the soil and destroy all of the debris from the floods in the Times Beach location. And that was temporary. And it took 2 years to complete the cleanup. And actually today, from 1999 on until today, the state of Missouri actually turned the Times Beach area into a state parkway. And so the graph that I used to represent this is the spend. You can see various spends on Times Beach. Some of them total over $200 million, but I think some good percentages is a lot of it was spent on the Superfund, which is the blue, and the orange, the state of Missouri buying out the houses, and then the majority of the rest of the money was spent on the incinerator and all of the labor that would take to excavate the soil, to bring it to the incinerator, to also safely remove the ashes. And there was another a portion of money that was to be given back to the government as a reimbursement from the company that now owned the company that ultimately created this byproduct. And so I think some of the legacy of Times Beach, this is something that every time an environmental disaster happens, but just the dangers of being irresponsible with hazardous chemicals and how that can really affect people and livelihoods. It's interesting here that we used is the levels, parts per billion by location of a few other areas that were impacted by TCDD. Some of them much higher than Times Beach actually, and they didn't have the same type of response. It's kind of on the bottom it showed when these various things happened. Love Canal in New York was in the 50s, then New York, New Jersey, and then actually because dioxin was used as a herbicide in Agent Orange in Vietnam War, that was another location that was highly affected by this. And I think that this all sort of brings it back to the decision of like, was it a good idea for the Superfund to buy the town? What were the true dangers of dioxin, and perhaps was Times Beach still considered potentially safe? The CDC considers 1 part per billion to be a hazard to human health, but that's something that's been highly debated since then. And I think as a summary, I wanted to focus just on how a lot of the themes that we've been talking about in this global environmental health class have come up as I was researching Times Beach. The polluter pays is the first one, and that's the company Syntax, who owned the smaller chemical factory. They were the ones that had to pay for the incinerator, and they had to pay the government a reimbursement for this danger that they caused. This idea of a threshold level for chemicals, for dioxin, is something we talked about. The lethal dose is something that was talked about a lot in the research about dioxin's effect on animals. We talked about acute and chronic exposures and those from dioxin and what could happen, the exposure pathways, and then I think the risk assessment process, which was what ended up happening once the Superfund came in. And so to end, here's just my list of references where I took from some scholarly articles as well as some newspapers. Archive, I think the really interesting stuff was articles, particularly from the New York Times, that had come out in the 80s as it was all happening, and to get like a first-person perspective. Thank you very much.